Ara here. Today I wanted to come on here and do a video about deal breakers, toxic people, and boundaries. They all are kind of like can be talked about in tandem and kind of all fit inside the same basket. I think it's something that just needs to be talked about more and can help eliminate a lot of the shame we tend to have after dealing with multiple abusers or after dealing with abuse. Also, it can help us avoid toxic people, avoid abusive people, and know whether we need to walk away or whether we need to set a boundary, and to kind of know how to navigate the world, because we are not obligated to just accept everything that comes our way. We're allowed to kind of be a boat on the water and steer around things. So yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and jump right into it. I think when we talk about deal breakers and toxic people, we don't talk about, when these things need to be done or, how they need to be done. I think kind of deal breakers and boundaries are one of those things where people say it a lot, but then they never really give you insight on like when to do it or how to do it or how to actually implement it and how like it looks like in action. And, it's always frustrating because, in my life, and in my experience of dealing with abuse and trying to recover from abuse, like one of the biggest things I always heard people say was like, you need to set boundaries, you need to have deal breakers. And those were good terms to learn. But then it was like, okay, but how does a person who was punished for setting boundaries and who, was attacked physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually for having boundaries, how do you go about like setting a boundary then? It's like, I think Lisa A. Romano would say, like, we were never given these tools. We have a shed, or we have a toolkit. And when we open up our toolkit, we don't have that tool. And we can't like ask to borrow somebody else's. We can't ask other people to fight our battles for us. So what do you do? How do we go about obtaining that tool? Like, what do we do? And I know for me personally, it was always like, what do I do? Like, I was always told to set boundaries, but it's like, you can't set what you don't have. And it kind of stopped there. It was like, okay, how do I stop people from hurting me? Or how do I stop attracting toxic people? Set boundaries. Okay, well, if I need to set boundaries, how do I set boundaries? Set boundaries. Okay, but how do I set boundaries? And then a lot of times, like, to have deal breakers. Okay, but if I have deal breakers, like, how do I decide what my deal breakers are? What constitutes as a deal breaker? What is something, like, how do I know when to set a boundary? Like, it all gets very confusing, and I don't think people do a good job of really talking about that. So I want to really talk about that. And so, I think to start off, we have to kind of stop, and I think I have to kind of address a certain demographic of people. Like, as a person who's encountered like serial toxic people and like multiple toxic people, I really thought, like, when I noticed I was experiencing a lot of abuse in my life and that I was this lack of boundaries and this lack of deal breakers was causing me to like have all these horrible experiences, the first thing I wanted to do was change myself. And for probably like over a year, I spent beating myself over the head, shaming myself for having certain behaviors, like trying to make myself feel guilty about doing certain things, being too nice, doing too much of this, doing too much of that. I thought that if I changed myself, I would stop attracting these toxic people. But what ended up happening when I tried to change myself, I was changing myself by shaming myself and by trying to like bully myself out of having certain behaviors, and I just started to hate myself. And that wasn't what was helpful, and that isn't how you stop attracting horrible people. And I don't even necessarily know if it's not about, oh, I attract toxic people. It wasn't that I attracted toxic people. It was that I wasn't repelling toxic people. And that's like a big part of this. I'm going to tie it all together in a second, so hold on. But I think when it comes to, toxic people, a lot of times we're taught like, I'm just an abusable person, I need to set boundaries, I need to do this, and it starts with I need to stand up for myself. We tell ourselves that we need to do all these things, but again, like I said earlier, we don't know how, so we don't do them. So then we start shaming ourselves because we don't know how, and we just bully ourselves and hope miraculously one day we'll change, but we don't. We just hate ourselves. And I think we have to remember that we don't need to change ourselves, we need to change our standards. And like I said, it's not about who you attract, it's about who you repel. Because when we start understanding who we are and what our character is and who we've become because of abuse, we're able to kind of build our boundaries and our deal breakers around that, which I'll get a little bit more into later. And then we're able to repel these toxic people. We're able to decide, hey, I don't want to tolerate that. Hey, I'm not okay with that. Hey, And it starts by, I'll get into that in a second, but we really need to understand that, like, we do not need to bully and change ourselves. We do need to change, but that change doesn't come from trying to, like, harass and bully. We need to, like, what Lisa A. Romano says, nudge the judge. We need to make sure that we are looking at ourselves with love and with respect and understanding that we are trying our best, and that if you've been socialized to harm yourself, like when you're in a situation where you're dealing with an abuser, a lot of times you become somebody out of pure survival. You have to take on a passive personality just to get out alive, or you have to disassociate. And a lot of the lack of boundaries we have, and the lack of deal breakers, and our people pleasing behaviors, and our inability to stand up for ourselves oftentimes comes from a place of having to survive, and our brain loving us enough, and ourselves loving ourselves enough to keep ourselves safe and sane. But then when we're out of those situations, we oftentimes, like, have all these issues, and we go out into the world and we attract more people like that person because we're not repelling those people. And another thing I want to say is there's no such thing as I attract toxic people, or you attract abusers or toxic people, or I'm just a person who attracts narcissists or toxic. That's not what happens. It's not that you attract narcissists. It's that you're not repelling them. And so I'm going to talk about how we can start setting boundaries, how somebody who has no boundaries can set boundaries, and how we can start having our deal breakers. And so, yeah. So I think the first thing that needs to take place when learning how to kind of avoid toxic people, have deal breakers and set boundaries, is we have to kind of identify our empty buckets, and we have to identify the ways in which we oftentimes are like, we're naive, if that makes sense. And it's not even about being naive. It's about the places where we have lack, the places where we've been denied things. And because we've been denied those things, we're oftentimes very susceptible. Like, for example, I said in an earlier video, like, I was denied a lot of kindness when I was younger, and that a lot of people didn't show me kindness and weren't very nice to me or kind to me at all. So and it was because I was in a situation, I'm not going to get into why, but people just, all throughout my life, I was always targeted, and I was like that person who was always bullied. Like, I was never shown kindness from anyone, and I had a few friends, but it wasn't like enough to deter from the fact that a lot of people saw me as a target because I didn't fit in where I grew up. And so it's one of those things where it's like, because I was denied kindness, when I would go out into the world, like when I got to college, when people would be kind to me, I'd be like, oh my God, they're such this great person. They're so great. Because that was somewhere where I lacked, and I had a lack of love in my life. And that was a space in my existence and in my body and in my levels that I was lacking. And being shown kindness almost made me fall for the kind trap. It made me believe that if somebody was kind, I could take them for face value and they'd be kind to me throughout the rest of eternity, that we were friends or we knew each other, which wasn't the case. And so empty buckets are places where you are predispositioned to be naive because of some type of hiccup in your past. So like for me, I was denied kindness. Anything you were denied and that you've lacked is an empty bucket. So if you were denied kindness, that's an empty bucket that you have. You're more susceptible to falling for people who are just kind. If you had an emotionally unavailable parent, or if you've had an emotionally unavailable partner, you're probably going to fall for somebody who's very, you will probably like fall for people who are very, very attentive, and you might fall for somebody who love bombs you. Like, those are just some examples. So in order to start this process, we have to identify our empty buckets. So we need to maybe sit down and maybe pull out a notebook, maybe make a list, and start systemically listing all the ways in which you feel like in your life you had lack. And I am looking through a notebook here, and I wrote like a whole thing of things that were essentially what are defined as empty buckets. And so I wrote compassion. I was never given compassion, acknowledgement of abuse, and validation of pain and trauma. I wrote sensitivity to mental health and feelings, or acknowledgement of mental health. And so these are things that I was denied in my existence when I was navigating the world. If somebody showed me these things, I was susceptible, and I'd be like, oh my God, they're so great. So let me read some other ones. Being obsessively watched and over criticized. Okay, so I had a parent who had sociopathic tendencies, and for me, that parent would watch me and criticize everything that I did to a point where I couldn't even pick up a gallon of milk without this person saying I was crazy or I was wrong, or like there was no room where I wasn't criticized. And so it was one of those things where I realized an empty bucket of mine was like when somebody didn't criticize me right off the bat, I was like, oh, they're a great person. But again, that's not true. And so this will kind of flip into deal breakers in a second. But yeah, like the first step of starting this process of like setting boundaries and avoiding toxic people is not criticizing yourself, not bullying yourself, not shaming yourself and feeling horrible. Like, I need to defend myself more. I need to do this. I need to do that. Like, I need to stop being so nice. Don't change yourself. Rather, identify your empty buckets. That's a better answer. So sit down like I did and write out like, okay, so these are the things I've been historically denied in my life. And so these are things that when they are given to me, I am more likely to fall for them. And so this helps you not to be desperate. This helps you not to just take people at face value. And it helps slow down that process of when you meet people, taking things slow. Like, it's like, these are things that if somebody does, I'm automatically going to think that they're just a great person. So let me stop, because this is how we get caught up in toxic people. We have an empty bucket, and as soon as they show us a little bit of something, we're ready to like jump in bed, or we're ready to just be their best friend, or we're ready to wife them or husband them, or we're ready to just like partner them, or we're ready to be like, we're ready to take them at face value, and that's not healthy. And I think disrupting that whole like concept of like, here's a person, they're nice, let me be best friends with them. And I'm a person who like, I've never, I'm somebody who I spend a lot of time by myself, and I'm not somebody who likes a lot of friendships. I like a few, not a lot. And so, but I know there's people who really do put a lot of weight in friendships and relationships, and they feel like they always have to have friends and family around them at all times. And so if you're that person, I think this applies to you 10 times more than it applies to anybody else. So yeah, this will kind of flip into deal breakers here in a second. But like, when we look at our list of empty buckets, I'm reflipping through my notebook to find them because I like closed it dramatically. But when we're talking about our empty buckets, they kind of flip into our deal breakers. So a deal breaker is like something that if it happens, like it's something that is like an ultimate, like absolutely no. Like if you do this thing, like it'll end the friendship relationship immediately. Like it's things that we will not tolerate under any circumstance. And when I say like it's things that we won't tolerate in other people. I always say the word you, but I mean like it's something that you will not tolerate from other people. So for example, I won't tolerate somebody who doesn't acknowledge my trauma or acknowledge my pain or that I dealt with abuse. If a person does not acknowledge that I've dealt with abuse or acknowledge that people deal with abuse in general, I want nothing to do with them. Or if they ever invalidate my experience, that's a no. That's immediate a no. An example of another deal breaker, I'm just doing the ones based on what I wrote. People who are hypercritical, people who watch you like a hawk just so that they can criticize you, or everything you do they have something to say. I don't put up with that. Like if you are critical, hypercritical, if you watch people too closely, that's an absolute no for me. Like if you have one time to do that and I'm gonna dump you. I'm gonna tell you we can't be friends. I'm gonna give some examples of a few more, sorry. But I first want to say like there are like really weird people in the world who think that this is weird. Like that think having boundaries and having deal breakers is weird. It's not. Like, I think it's sad that we live in a world where we think that we have to put up with abuse, and if we don't, we're being unfair. It's like, no, I'm not being unfair. I'm being very fair. You can't, there are just some things that you shouldn't have to tell people to do or not do. And nobody should read your mind. Nobody's a mind reader. So don't be childish about it. But it's still like, there are some things I shouldn't have to tell you to do. I shouldn't have to tell you not to hit me. I shouldn't have to tell you not to touch me inappropriately. I shouldn't have to tell you not to hawk watch me. So if you in your brain right now are like, you know, Aria sounds a little rash right now. Like that doesn't sound like healthy to end a friendship because somebody does something. Well, that's kind of when the whole when do I walk away, when do I set a boundary comes in, because it's one of those things where there are some things that it's like, and keep in mind, all of our deal breakers are different. So your deal breakers are going to be different than my deal breakers. And deal breakers, like I said, are things that we will not tolerate under any circumstance. It can be addiction. It can be, you know, those are deal breakers. But when it comes to boundaries are, you know, when we say no, when we kind of draw a line in the sand and say, I'm not okay with this. And I'll get into when we do which one. But it's really important that you have deal breakers, because this is how we repeat the same cycle of abuse. When we don't have deal breakers, and we already have them. We have deal breakers a lot of times. We just don't realize it. Oftentimes, the fact that we were able to identify that we were in fact dealing with abuse was because our boundaries were violated. And because, like, if you have been in an abusive situation and you are out of that situation, you had a deal breaker. There was something that person did that was too far and you ended the whole thing, or something happened that made you want to end the whole thing. That's a deal breaker. Sometimes we just don't acknowledge them, and there is nothing wrong with having them, and it's healthier to have them up front than have to discover them as you're being abused. So don't ever, if somebody tells you having a deal breaker is unhealthy, they're unhealthy. Deal breakers are normal, and you have to have them I'm not going to say if you want to avoid abuse, but if you want to stop, if you find yourself in a pattern of like dealing with abusive people or toxic people, that's how you disrupt it. It doesn't get disrupted by like not being attentive to it and by not actually like addressing it, or by just bullying yourself into like quitting certain behaviors, or you know, it happens by a conscious effort to identify where we have lack, so we need to identify where we have lack, and we also need to identify what we aren't willing to put up with, because that'll save you years of your life. So I just really needed to give that disclaimer. It is not unhealthy to have deal breakers at all. It's very healthy. You should have them, and it's better to have them up front. So some other examples of deal breakers are like, you know, you not tolerating addiction, not tolerating a lack of communication. So like Dana Morningstar always says, we need to strive for relationships and friendships and acquaintanceships that have open, honest, sincere open, honest, sincere, solutions-oriented communication. And what that means is people who can be like, you should be able to be forward about your feelings, or when somebody steps on your feet or hurts your boundaries or crosses your boundaries. Like, we need to be able to articulate when we're feeling uncomfortable and work to a solution when it comes to like relationships and friendships. And if we can't do that, that's a red flag. And we don't do people who are petty and who do silent treatment and who retaliate or who put their hands on us or whatever the case may be. We have to have people who, when you tell them there's a problem, they're like, here we go again. Or they get offended when you talk about your feelings. Like, none of that's normal. Or they slam doors and cabinets. None of that's normal. So a deal breaker in that situation was like, you have to be able to articulate your feelings and hear the feelings of other people without getting emotional and disruptive and offended. Like, if you hurt somebody, you should want to know that and work towards a solution. So that's a big not empty bucket. That's a big deal breaker. Another deal breaker for me is like, I don't do bigotry of any kind. I'm very, very, very passionate about when it comes to understanding racism, understanding white supremacy, understanding a bunch of different things. And if I even get a whiff of bigotry, if I get a whiff of white supremacy, if I get a whiff of homophobia, if I get a whiff of transphobia, if I get a whiff of anything, I don't care if you're learning, I don't care if you're growing, I don't care if you like, I don't think it's okay to see marginalized people as collateral damage. We cannot that's like so abusive. You can't say, oh, well, I'm learning and we know we all make mistakes. That's like the same thing as saying boys will be boys. Like, you can't, like, marginalized bodies and people who have historically oppressed identities aren't collateral damage in your privileged pathway to enlightenment and social awareness. Like, no. Like, harming, not knowing something or being ignorant is not your right to abuse another person, and people aren't obligated to be your collateral damage or to pretend like your behavior isn't harmful just because you don't know it is, or just because you don't care that it is, which is usually the case. So, and there's a reason why that's so important to me, but I'm not going to get into it here. But yeah, I don't do that. I shouldn't have to teach you how to treat me or anybody else like a person. And that's a whole different conversation. In the areas that I'm privileged, that's a whole different thing. But it's like, you know, I don't do people who don't want to understand that they are not the standard of the universe. Another thing is, yes, another one of my deal breakers is people who don't seem to understand that they aren't the standard of anything. Like, I have a lot of them, so I'm picky. But if you think that you are the center of the universe and you think that everything revolves around you, you are not somebody who I want to be around. That's very scary. Like, I don't do people who, like, for example, I used to have a roommate years ago who, she couldn't handle this idea that people could be different than her. She was just a very unintelligent, crass person who just she just wasn't smart enough to handle the fact that she, in her overprivileged existence, was not the standard that everybody else in the universe had to follow. So she was very critical, and so she just was very like she would just get confused if you did something different than her. And sometimes it wasn't even that, I don't know, she was just weird. I don't do that. So if you are shocked that you aren't the center of the universe, oh, absolutely not. I don't do people who don't have empathy. That's a huge one for me. Like, if you don't have empathy, and like you can't hear another person's experience that may not be your own, and you can't like be like, hey, like that's fucked up, or that's like, if you can't contextualize other people's experience unless it's happened to you and you don't have an ability to look outside of your own experience, absolutely not. That's a big red flag for me. Another deal breaker for me is people who interrupt me or actively speak over me when I speak. That's like I hate that. These could be pet peeves too, but they're things that and I know this sounds so petty, like, why do you have so many? You know, you're not gonna find anybody. Like, nobody doesn't do any of those things. Actually, there are people who've done none of those things to me, and they're in my life right now, and they're great. Like, don't ever get into the mindset that like, oh, I have too many deal breakers and I'm not gonna find anybody. You don't want people who do things that piss you off. And of course, deal breakers aren't like, I don't like the color blue on like my boyfriend, and I don't want men who wear the color blue. Like, no, that's not a deal breaker, sweetie. Or like, and like I said, I might have to go into a dreaded part two, but like, there's a difference between like a deal breaker and a boundary. So a boundary is when somebody does something that we can work out. Like, for example, if me and my friend have a misunderstanding, we can work through that. But if my friend does something that reflects a distinct problem within their personality, and it's not just like a miscommunication, it's like, this is something they do a lot, and this is something that is coming from like a dominant personality trait of theirs, that's when it becomes a deal breaker. Because there are times where like things happen, friends make mistakes, you know, I've had a few friends accidentally speak over me, but it's like they stop and they apologize, right? Or like I say, hey, can you not speak over me? Like, I remember we were talking and you kind of spoke over me there. They'll be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I won't do that anymore. And I'm like, thanks. Like, we can work through it. Within any friendship, there is going to be some miscommunications, and relationships too. But like, it's when it's not a miscommunication and like a prominent trait of a certain person and or people's is doing problematic things. And again, these things don't have to be universally true. If these things are bothersome to you, that's all that matters. Sometimes it's not that people are bad, it's just that they're bad for us. So understand that, like, it's not always that like, Jarl is evil. It's more like, maybe Jarl is just not for you. But sometimes it is, oh, Jarl's evil. And so like, again, I have a slew of deal breakers, but they're all very normal. And I suggest that not only do you make a list of empty buckets, but you make a list of deal breakers. So like I said, make a list of deal breakers. And one more last minute deal breaker, because I think this is important. People who abuse their mental health and try and make everybody their therapist. That's a big one. Like that's like these are some of my deal breakers are really good ones for you all to build your deal breakers off of, because these are like universally like kind of wrong things. Not always, but usually, yeah. You know, we need to support our friends, but I might tell this story on here. If anybody wants a story time, I can give one, because I have a juicy one with a specific person. But, you know, people who, you know, we're all vulnerable. We all deal with things. And, you know, I'm no stranger to mental health issues. Most people aren't. And we need to support each other. But at the same time, there's a line. There's a boundary. And you can't... Other people aren't responsible for your mental health, and we can support each other, but that doesn't mean you have the right to like project your mental health onto other people and try and bully them into being an unconsensual therapist. Demanding large amounts of emotional labor from other people is incredibly immoral and unethical, and it's this assumption that the fact that you're assuming that anybody has the energy to put up with you in that way is very ableist and is very hateful. And it's this assumption that like, as a person with a mental illness, I don't have the energy to play therapist with another person, and I can support my friends, but that's not the same as dumping your issues out on other people. Like I can support my friends, but it's not okay that my friends dump their issues out on me, vice versa. And there's a difference between supporting your friends versus letting your friends take advantage of you and letting them dump all over you. So don't let people dump all over you. And if you see somebody who is a little bit too quick to overshare and it kind of tends to want everybody to be their therapist, run. That's a deal breaker. It never ends well. Just trust me. But yeah, that was my last minute deal breaker. But yeah, I don't want to go on for too long. I'm going to go ahead and split this off into a part 2, because I just don't want to have to, you know, make this super long, but I like long videos. So yeah, those are some examples of some deal breakers, of some empty buckets. So that's the first 2 things you need to do. And I already explained boundaries, but I'm going to get into specifically when to walk away versus when do we nick something as a deal breaker and walk away versus when to set a boundary in the next video, because I think that's really important. So yeah. So this has been Gucci, so I'm going to go ahead and peace out. Bye. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Now. Bye.